some of their stories, because the book relates to that. It relates, the final product of the book is, a kind of result of my own experiences within the kind of dynamic that people have been describing. So some of the, what some people might think of as weirdness, the difference, but, not just being a straightforward standard book, just telling a story, making a philosophical argument, all of the trickster kind of backwards, making fun of stuff and humor and relayering things sort of comes out of trying, and being unsuccessful in presenting this in a straightforward way. So when I was a graduate student at Indiana University, I had a fairly good experience there. At least the people that were there were supportive of me trying to do what I wanted to do. There wasn't really anyone there for me to work with. The reason why I went there really was because there was so much support. They were just like, yeah, we'd love for you to come here and do this. Maybe also at the time, maybe Vine was thinking about, well, actually had been offered a job there in the law school, but they ended up rejecting his association in religious studies, because in order for him to get the sort of position in law school, he needed to be in several places. It was a endowed chair, and the religious studies people were like, no, he's not really, a religious studies scholar, right? And so he ended up not taking that and going back to Arizona for a while, before he finally retired completely. But that was only, really, I didn't have a lot of other choices, because most of the other places that I had looked at for grad school in philosophy were just, they were simply like, sure, we wouldn't mind you coming here to kind of check off a box of minority status, but if you come here, you're going to do, exactly what we tell you to do, and there's not going to be any wiggle room. You're going to do, analytic philosophy, even within that sort of framework. The limitations not only of what diversity in philosophy in the broad global sense, but even diversity in philosophy between, the analytic and continental tradition was not acceptable even. So Indiana University had a lot of history people, it just was a kind of place that seemed very supporting. There was this possibility of Vine coming there. So I went there, and one of the good things, I guess, about the place was that there was a kind of laissez-faire process of doing philosophy. I've seen a lot of departments since then. Of course, I grew up on the Navajo reservation. I only accidentally went to college in the first place, because we moved my final year of high school. We moved from Arizona to a little town called Binkelman, Nebraska, on the border of Colorado and Nebraska. My dad was a preacher, and he took a job there in a little church in this little town, in farm town on the border of Colorado and Nebraska, for my last year of high school. And everybody was talking about going to college. The first time I'd ever heard of college was, when I was almost 18. So I'm like, I guess I better try to go to college. Everyone seems to be, and I tried actually several times and failed before I kind of went back to community college and, sort of found my way through it. But, I had no real experience at all. I didn't know what, college was even like, graduate school, the disciplines of anything, academic life, and so on. So, here I am in graduate school, and there was a kind of hands-off approach, just like, well, you have to take these courses, but other than that, you just kind of make your own way, and you write a proposal, and you put a committee together, you write a dissertation, if it passes, you graduate. There wasn't, all this kind of real formal kind of testing and stuff that I see in a lot of other programs that really kind of try to harness you into a particular way of thinking and a particular, disciplinary framework. So I was able to, within that, just try to figure out how in the world, can I do what I want to do, which was, as people are describing, to try to think about Indigenous philosophy, to sort of talk about my own experiences, what I knew, what other people knew, what I could learn from, the people that are on this panel that were writing things at the time and have written things since, and from Vine, from all the sort of people that I met along the way, from Lee, when we all sort of got together. I first met Lee, I think it was 1999 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That was the first time I showed up at one of the APA meetings where we kind of
that was where Vine wasn't Vine there at that time? Yeah, right.
Vine came. There was a nice little group of people, and that was my first, having some other people to talk to. I was a graduate student at the time, and just trying to, I was having conversations with Vine mostly over email, but kind of trying to figure out what can I do within this, and it was very limiting, as people were describing. There was sort of like, well, that doesn't, if you can find some way to kind of prove that what you're talking about connects to, or is some version of, Aristotle or something else, right, then it's sort of relevant or meaningful. But, anything that is kind of from Indigenous language or Indigenous, point of view, worldview, cultural framework, any of that is not philosophy. It's just something as anthropology or something like that, right? And so trying to figure out how to do this, and mostly on my own, at least where I was at. I had few other people around to read and talk to in these organizations with the different names that it's been called. I think it was first called the Committee on the Status of American Indians in Philosophy. That was what that committee was in the APA that I joined as a graduate student. So I kind of put together a dissertation and on kind of Indigenous environmental ethics, because that's what I came up with as a place to kind of make a connection. It wasn't really like I wanted to write about environmental ethics in a particular way, but it was like I can find some connection there, that maybe there'll be some resonance with what I have to say, and at least I can kind of try to bring in, there's so much kind of in environmental talk in general, this kind of reference to, Indigenous ways of being and knowing, and the land and these sorts of things, so that, maybe I can, interrogate those a little bit more, I can kind of find a way to start a conversation in that little cubbyhole of philosophy that won't get, swept out the door, like a bunch of rats sort of, infesting your house or whatever. So I produced this, dissertation. I can't even remember what the name of it was, something like something about kinship, and I can't even remember what the name of our dissertation was. It has been that long, 20 more than 20 years ago. But that sort of formed the basis of the book, was this kind of, the trying to articulate some Indigenous notions of environmental ethics, and engaging that with, traditional Western environmental ethical conversations and frameworks. So I started working on this as a book, Respect for Kinship. That was the name of my dissertation. And I tried to expand on this and turn it into a book. And I sent it to various publishers, and there was reviews on it. And it was something very similar to what Dennis was saying, that the reviews were basically like, there was two reviews, you get your kind of two, negative reviews at least on the two polls. And one was basically, it's too white, and the other was like, it's too Indian, right? Right. One was like, it's too sort of philosophical. It's not like really native studies, it doesn't, it's sort of this too theoretical, all this kind of stuff. That's not how we do native study stuff. And the other stuff was like, it's too kind of out there. It's not really engaging with all the sort of Western theorists of environmental ethics. so I couldn't get anyone to take the book seriously, right? And so I started thinking about why, like, what are they saying, and why does it sort of come down in this particular way, and why is, why are people unable to engage with this book on the level that I want them to, right? To be able to read it and be able to interact with it as it's intended, right? Rather than, trying to, like, this is not philosophy, or it's sort of, whatever, all these kinds of things. So I started kind of rewriting the book as another book about the book, right? As a way to kind of, present the book, or, not really even present the book per se. I mean, I guess one way you could say a way of trying to present the book, but another way is trying to tear down, find a way to push back and crack holes in the barriers that were keeping people from reading the book, right? To kind of deconstruct, I guess you could say, but in my terms, I think of it as sort of the trickster kind of methodology, right? Using all these forms that, as Indigenous people, I think are commonplace. It's not like I'm making these up or kind of using them in ways that they're not already there, just kind of using these in a kind of philosophical framework of things like humor, right? That we think even just the idea that philosophy or academia or any of these things is serious business, right? That you can't joke around. You can't, that if you say something funny, it's the opposite of what's meaningful. Like, serious and funny are kind of polarities. And if you're funny, you're not serious, right? In the sense of, like, producing something meaningful, doing something important. If you're joking around, it's not important anymore. And, playing with all these sort of, binaries in a way that tries to, not only disarm, but try to deconstruct in some way some of these, the ways in which people interpret what is philosophy, and even try to read this book through these, lenses of, truth and meaning and so on, that exist at this abstract level of what I call in the book delocality, right? Just floating free from the land, the truth, the meaning of stuff, philosophy, being, ethics, rightness, justice, these sort of concepts that have no context, right? In a kind of real way, not just context in the sense that we think about it, through situated knowledges or standpoint theory, where we're trying to kind of bring it back down to the ground to try to find a place to put it, but just never letting it leave, right? It comes out of a particular place, comes out of a particular relationality that we exist in, that everything comes out of, and, keeping it there, recognizing that part of its meaning is that place that it is, right? And trying to sort of produce a text that not only talked about that, but tried to get people to be able to appreciate that. So that's the, what I wanted to say, like, about the book, at least at a meta level, that I think is kind of helpful for those of you who read it, or if you're trying to read it, for understanding these kind of layers of it, that there are times where it sort of seems like a serious book, and then sometimes it seems like like some funny stories, and like telling stories about, how people might read a book like this to kind of reframe that conversation. And that's kind of why, because there's this layered history of, writing the book and then trying to write another book that is the, like, code book for the book, to get people to be able to read it, and not only just a code book, but to try to get, push the envelope for people to be able to come to it for the first time without all these sort of preconceptions and all of this, codified and rigid sort of notions of truth and meaning and so on, that don't allow you to see the rich tapestry of, Indigenous knowledge and philosophy for what it already is, right? Being produced for thousands of years by Indigenous people, the world over, right? So that's my beginning spiel.
Well, that tells me
I was
what, Brian. When I read your book, I laughed like hell. I said, I'd say, is this guy really serious?
So Dennis, you've turned on your mic. Do you want to keep it on for a few minutes and respond to some of the things that Brian has said?
No, I'll let somebody else go. I'll turn my mic off.
Lee, you're next to Brian on my screen. Would you mind now?
Well, I was a little bit surprised that you took the tack of explaining more about how the book came about than about the book itself. I kind of studied up on the book, so I would be able to say things. I want to say that I went into it kind of critically. I'm always somewhat critical of anything related to natives, and I came out of it being very pleased with the contents. I think that the notions that he's getting across are exactly right. The question that I have is does concern the voice that he uses. There certainly are trickster interludes, but I really did find it to be fairly classical scholarship outside of the trickster interludes. And of course, obviously there's going to be a segue between the one voice and the other voice. But the thing is that I saw two voices there, not just a single voice. And I kind of wonder the extent to which Brian either feels as if he's been affected by academia for that other voice, or alternately, the extent to which he affects the academic voice to find acceptance and to go ahead and slide in the trickster elements. How would you classify these two different elements of yourself?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I like to say, I mean, I was just talking about the context of the book, but anything that people want to share or talk about, I'm ready to listen for sure. I mean, I guess one of the things, just like what I was saying, that there's a complexity in the book because it was sort of written in some ways by different people, right? Because some of it comes from the graduate student to me, and then shortly after that, where I was trying to do this particular kind of thing, and trying to find a home in Western philosophy, the academy, and find resonance, find someone to listen to me within that framework. And then there's clearly the other kind of voice or person that's responding to that and writing about that. So I think that there might be kind of more like three altogether, right? So there's parts of it when I look at it, I can see, and some of it I've tried to even adjust some of that over editing of it to make it less distinct or less kind of separate. But sometimes there's stuff in the book that is just comes out of even the stuff where there's a section where I talk about like the things that environmental ethicists can learn from this, right? that's more just, that's that other person, like, here's some things, even if you don't really want, think that, what I'm saying is true at any kind of deeper level, you could sort of take these things out of it to use in your domain over there, while rejecting pretty much everything else that I'm saying, right? That's that person that's sort of speaking, trying to find acceptance in that framework at some level. And then there's the voice, the person that's critical of that, some perhaps at a kind of radical level, even of there's no hope for this way of thinking that we call philosophy, with the big T of truth and all these kinds of things. And so maybe it's the middle ground in between there is kind of the part that you're probably really asking about, right? Because there's me kind of thinking about this now and writing about it. There's the earlier Brian that's sort of writing this initial book out of my dissertation. And when I'm trying to, there's probably stuff that's in between that, when there's stuff that I'm still kind of carrying, that sort of, a need for acceptance, or trying to, articulate this through kind of classic scholarship and, some not. So I think that's where the more kind of problematic part is, right? I could sort of point to, here's just the earlier me, and then here's clearly me kind of, writing about, my experiences. But I bet that there's parts in there that I am not really even sure of what's going on myself, right? I think that those are maybe even at some level, it's kind of like, psychological questions about, like how well we know our own intentions. Even if I tell myself I'm trying to do this, there's probably some that I'm still trying to find that acceptance, that the voice is really like, will you please listen to me, rather than, just trying to say what I think of that I should say, or whatever. I mean, that's the best answer I guess I can give it at this point. I could think about sort of looking at particular parts and what's going on there, as I have sometimes. I look at this and I'm like, what was I exactly thinking in writing this passage? Like, like even that, like, why did I really keep in all that stuff about here's some points that the environmental ethicist can sort of take out of this, right? That seems to be not really changes the framework of the overall message, right? Those are my thoughts right now, I guess.
My turn.
Lee, did you want to continue, or did you want to throw?
Do I kind of like do a follow-up in a sense?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay. I think maybe I will go ahead and push him a little bit more on the kind of Western scholarly element of the writing. And I don't know if he's being kind of polite to non-Indians or what, but I really do wonder the extent to which he thinks that he could have used a more Indigenous voice and still managed to be published. Okay, I guess I'll put it in a really, really pushy way, okay, because that was kind of what was a little bit behind what I was originally saying.
Yeah, I got you. That's helpful. That's really interesting way to think about it. Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this a lot because I'm working on another book, and I've been thinking about how to, like, where to even try to publish this, because excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. Yes, I didn't sneeze after all. Because I want to reach, I mean, this book nicely, surprisingly for me, has reached a pretty broad audience relative to a just a standard academic press, publication. Much more than they expected, for sure, the Michigan State University Press. But I thought about, trying to go a little, broader, not even with an academic press, but something even with a more, broader kind of public audience. Because, and maybe it's sort of like what this question sort of gets to, in terms of my own journey in different places that I've been, sort of struggles with trying to be accepted at some level by, Western philosophical academy, right? And maybe kind of that's what you're kind of seeing, maybe kind of picking up on really insightfully in the book, is sort of some of the struggles with that, right? Because there are times where I've just let it go, right? I'm just like, I don't really care what you think about this. Like, I'm trying to sort of, tell this story in the best way that I know how, and that's it. If you think it's garbage or whatever, that's your thing, and I don't really care. And then other times where I'm struggling with, like, I want you to kind of accept me, right? I want you to be like, yeah, this is philosophy, and this is okay, and you're one of us, and all this kind of thing. And so I thought about, even since then, I've kind of thought about how to move forward, and sometimes I kind of see myself push back to, like, I want to sort of do this in a more serious way, or, kind of continue on with what I started, in this book sort of even further, right? So I've thought about trying to write a book, a kind of, a kind of follow up to this book that's even more kind of, like you're saying, sort of written with, an Indigenous voice, like through stories and conversation and so on, something that I imagine wouldn't get published at all by an academic press, that they'd be like, this is just, there's a line and you've just crossed it altogether, right? That somehow with this book, I've kind of towed the line enough that there's enough over on that line that they can see the serious scholarship kind of thing from their perspective. And so it's kind of acceptable, if still quite pushing the boundaries, that the version that I'm thinking of, like, would not be, published by an academic press, at least, and be considered, philosophy by the kind of serious, philosophers. But I think that might be I mean, the way to go, right? I mean, that, like, as you're saying, kind of, what's the mission here, right? If is the mission here to, to put this out in an Indigenous way, as you're saying, kind of, indigenize it, as the kids say these days, or to, try to fit in. And I think that's those are the kinds of questions. And I think that if you do try to do this kind of just straightforward, then, I mean, you do run into, challenges getting it published, at least in the, the academic kind of, setting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the things that I'm concerned about a little bit is a kind of ghettoization that we can find ourselves in if we don't manage to pick up at least a certain amount of serious interest in the broader society. We can write things to ourselves all we want, but unless it's the case that we manage to get others to listen, we're not going to be, I think, moving ahead. And I think that your attempt to balance those voices is the kind of thing that we, unfortunately have to do in a lot of cases to get going. Now, hopefully, once we get going, I'm kind of hopeful that there will be a point where people will actually read the truly indigenous kind of book that we all might want to write. So yeah, that would be my hope. But in the meantime, I'm afraid we're kind of stuck there. But I think that what you did is exactly what had to be done. And like I said, I went into it critically, but at the end of it, basically found myself, kind of won over. It wasn't anything in there that I disagreed with. I thought that it was outstanding. I guess I've gotten out of the strictly philosophical mode, or whatever, out of the Western philosophical mode enough that sometimes I had a hard time. I had to really read it. Okay. But anyway, I do appreciate that, and I appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Hi, Brian. Hi, Brian.
Hello.
Just wondering whether they muted me or not.
Oh, no.
Just off the cuff here, there's a relatively simple solution to the publishing aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
Which is you just have to team yourself up with a white guy.
Right.
Right. So there's a little bit of an antidote to that, in that my colleague Doug Grab, where we first started talking about all this, the first edition of Indian from the Inside, when we were talking that up, Doug was pacing the floor back and forth, dictating and I was on the computer typing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, after he'd gone on for, I don't know, Doug's long-winded, right? Like most of you guys are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he'd come over and look and see what I was on the screen, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't say any of that." Yeah. Getting to your book, you start off. Well, I shouldn't say you start off, but one of the main characters that all this is based on is my hero, John Locke, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have this 4-volume set of John Locke on treatise on government and education, money, stuff like that. This was actually printed in 1779, right? So another interesting aspect of it is I would think that the quality of the paper that's in the book is probably as good today as it was when it was printed, right? So we've actually come a long way in making paper.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the quotes, one thing I'd like to quote in Locke, and which really got my ire up, I guess, back in the early days, is, and this is written in Old English, so I might stumble a little bit with it. In 108, he says, "Thus we see that the kings of the Indians in America, which is still a patron of the first ages in Africa and Europe, whilst the inhabitants were too few for the country, and want of people and money gave men no temptation to enlarge their possessions of land or consent for wider extent of ground, are little more than generals of their armies, though they command absolutely in war. Yet at home in a time of peace, they exercise very little dominion, but have a very moderate sovereignty. The resolutions in peace and war being ordinarily either in the people or in the council. Right? Though the war itself, which admits not the plurality of governors, naturally dissolves the command into the king's sole authority." So I think it's, in one sense, it's a very interesting description of Indigenous people in Americas prior to, right? Not necessarily that saying that he was, admiring them so much as he was saying, this is a put down because they're not civilized, stuff like this. But the other point that I want to make about that is, even though all these books have lasted over, the last couple of 300 years, it has recently come to light in an article, which again my colleague has come across, where John Locke's friend accuses John Locke of plagiarizing all of this. So John Locke may not necessarily fit that honored position of being the father of Euro-Western philosophy that everybody recognizes him to be, right? So, and I certainly wouldn't doubt that to any great extent. As far as the book is concerned, going past that on the philosophical implications and going back to Descartes and Hume and whatnot, yeah, those are quite relevant as far as painting the picture is concerned. And like I say, we do that in India from the inside very much. But the point we come to, and you come to the question of locality, right? So you're addressing locality, and we go in almost a different direction in looking at an outside view predicate, right? So again, Gord might appreciate this in that a lot of what my thinking has been, not so much certainly the you should still hear me?
Something weird's going on my screen.
Mine too, yeah. Can you still hear me?
I can.
You can still
Yeah,
hear
we're
you.
back. Something happened weird, but we're good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just passed out for. So anyway, what I was saying is when we get to his outside view predicate, and I say Gord might appreciate that as far as the legality in looking at early legislation, in particular 1857, an Act for Gradual Civilization of the Indian, which on one side put Indians outside of civil society, at the other, looking at another way, gave them the opportunity to be educated for civil society. And certainly there's a lot of discussion around that. But I would certainly like to see people buy this, right? Indian from the inside, because I get royalties on it, and I'm planning my retirement on the royalties. Just kidding. So locality, and like I say, matching that up, locality to outside view predicate, and taking off all the trimmings of what society has placed upon us, and the confusion that, again, I think Gord might appreciate in what it has done is in the resultants of that, i.e. poverty in First Nation communities and Indian reserves, the incarceration rate of Native people in prisons in Canada, and the one that's closest to my heart in all this is the high degree of suicide of young people in our communities. And I think at the end of the day, we're not placing enough emphasis on addressing those kinds of issues. Right? Towards the end, and I'll read a quote from you on page 298. It says, "In order to figure out what is right for me in my path, I must start with an attitude of respect." Right? This attitude first arises from the background context of universal sacrality. I am fully aware in my reflections on my particular relationships that all things near me now or at far distance are connected together in this web of life, and are each one imbibed with the sacredness and seriousness that this provides. What strikes me first of all when I read that is a little bit of the influence of Christianity. And I think Christianity, if more so in their relationship to what has happened to us over the period, the last 500 years, legislation is one thing, but I think Christianity has been more harmful than anything else, right? And has certainly changed our perceptions of it all. I've come to the point of looking at all this and in conversation with others and students and whatnot in the classroom. What I actually professed in the classroom, getting to that point, is that there's a driving force behind all of this. Basically, it narrows down to our survival, right? So our survival, and I think that's that's prominent in any species, whether whether it be animal species, whether it be trees, whether it be whatever. So that's at the core of it. How do you survive? And it's not just you in the physical sense of it, but also passing on that to next generations coming, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to do that, I see four main points to it. One is rather than respect is openness, right? Which is you have to see the world for what the world is, right? You can't put blinders on, you can't make excuses for it, you can't do any of that, right? So see it for what it is. Now, however you determine that, so you have to be honest about it, right? You can't play games and say, well, yeah, but these are the circumstances, blah, blah, blah. No, that's bullshit, right? So you have to see it for what it is. You have to be honest about it. You have to share that, right? So maybe other people don't see it, right? Or maybe they see it differently. Maybe there's influences all in all of us. Then you get to the point you have to respect all that, right? And if you don't respect all that, you don't, right? So openness, honesty, sharing, and respect. And I think those are the key elements of Indigenous people at the end of the day. Right? So anyway, that's my comments.
Okay, before you come on, Brian, I'm so happy Lorraine is here. So I am going to go invisible, and I'm asking Lorraine if she will turn on her audio and turn on her video. And you can say, please, Lorraine, a few words about yourself, because everyone introduced themselves, and I'd like to do that too. We've heard Brian's initial statement, Lee and now Dan have responded. So it would be Gord's turn after you have introduced yourself.
Say?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me? I can't get the video to work either. Sorry. I don't know what's wrong with my computer. Thank you, Brian, for your message. Anyway, Tansei, Kaganani Waho Maganak. I am Lorraine Mayer. I'm from Brandon University. I am Cree Métis. And I know all of these speakers. So that's as exciting as and I am deeply apologizing for my lateness. I'm up here in cold Manitoba, so you can all forgive me. And I would really rather hear, I'm sorry I missed most of what you were saying, Dennis. That really disappointed me, but we can talk later. In the meantime, I would like to hear Gord. I would love to hear from Gord.
Good morning, Lorraine. Long time no see.
Yeah.
And I understand Doug's on this Zoom call here too. I haven't seen Doug in quite a while. Hello, Doug. It's like a reunion of sorts.
It is.
Yeah. So I'm, if you don't mind, I'm going to maybe follow up a little bit on the way the conversation's been going, because it's different than I had perhaps expected. I thought we were going to get to the guts of the book, which Brian and I did at an earlier session like this. And it was quite an interesting discussion, but this is also quite illuminating to think about the nature of this kind of work and how to place it into the larger world out there. And it's an interesting time with COP26 on the horizon, just a few days away, and these kinds of larger conversations happening around the world about the mess we're in and what to do about it. And you would think you'd find a bigger audience for this kind of work, given that there's a growing awareness that the Western approach to dealing with nature is deeply flawed. And I appreciate the idea that Dennis was presenting, that we need to be open about things and such. But I think, you know, when you get to the point of respecting different people's points of view, you also have to be willing to challenge them on the points of view. And respect, I think, includes critically examining what other people are doing in terms of thinking about how they fit in the world. And I've come down to the position lately that there's just a large mistake being made by vast numbers of humans around the world, that there is this divide between human and nature, and you know, nature is there for us to use. We're misusing it now, perhaps, but we'll get it right. we'll have these gatherings of world leaders and we'll figure out what to do it all right. But it doesn't change the underlying notion that there's a thing that we can just do what we want with. We just have to figure out how to do it the right way so we don't kill ourselves in the process of doing it. And the flip side of that, I think, is something that comes out in Brian's book, which is a message that you can trace all the way back to many earlier generations of Indigenous scholars, I call them. I mean, people who've been speaking about this since the first time they interact with Europeans. There's a way of thinking of the world that puts us in the world, and it ties us to the world directly and deeply. The problem that I see in the current setting is that you can't really see a way to get from the world today, where you have a few small percentages of people scattered around the world who still think that way, and then the 95+% of people who think a different way. And how do you transform the world so that most people understand that the world around us is not something distinct from our being, it's part of our being, and we're part of it, it's part of us. This notion of connectedness can be talked about at an intellectual level, but it has to get into people's inner lives. And I see your work, Brian, is playing a role in that, but that's where the conversation needs to be going. Like, how do we get this message out there? But it's more than a message, it's a transformative movement. You want to have people not just think of the world this way, because that's not really adequate. You want people to somehow feel themselves in the world that way. I mean, how do you get that across in books? So that's when I have any thoughts about that. I imagine writing on environmental ethics, it must be something you're thinking about. How do we get from here to there? And you have the same idea of where there is. I've got this idea of there that's very utopian, but I think it's necessary if we're not a generation or two from now going to see the world in a a catastrophic state. I actually think the world's already in a catastrophic state, but even more catastrophic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Oh, both of both what Dennis shared and what Gordon shared. Yeah, I definitely think that, like, the idea of the more than a message, to start with that, right? The trying to not just convey something intellectual, but something more. And I think that's what really, once I started thinking about that part of writing, of being a scholar, or whatever, was really the change, the big change. And goes back to the things that Lee was even talking about, of like, still kind of trying to hold on to some of those things, and sometimes trying to do more, and then sometimes in the middle trying to kind of even use things that are available to produce a certain kind of result or feeling, right? So that's the kind of, once I sort of take up, for me, as a kind of academic mode, the Trickster kind of framework, then for me, it's never, at the end of the day, about just trying to present something that is intellectually true, but trying to get to push people's position, like in a physical, emotional way, right? That it becomes, I guess you would say, from philosophers' perspective, more rhetoric than philosophy, in the kind of classic distinction that Plato makes. But because even going back to what Dennis said about the notion of universal sacrality, and it's the kind of Christian ethos of kind of everything is sacred. At one level, it's just trying to convey, to get people to feel this notion of embeddedness, like what it's like to be there, like what it's like to kind of not be able to put yourself in a position above anything else or outside of the relational context that you're always moving in as a part of the earth, as part of a community, as a part of an ecosystem that you're embedded in and moving within at every moment you speak. There is no kind of before or after. You're just in that motion of relationality. And it's not as, that universal sacrality, defines the notion of the world, the value of the world from that perspective. It's just that there isn't, it takes away the capacity of putting, yourself or things above other things in this hierarchical framework of values. So there's this constant attempt, at least, sometimes flawed and failed, as any attempts like this would be, to do more than try to just describe intellectually something, but trying to talk about it in a way and tell stories about it in a way, use language in a way that pushes people in more than just a message, but pushes them in, to feel a different way, to be a different way, along that sort of line that you're talking about in terms of, giving us a capacity to feel the embeddedness of ourselves in the land, in the earth, in communities with kinship and all those things as a fact of what is, when Dennis talks about openness, right? To see it for what it is, right? To see ourselves in the world for who we actually are and what we actually are, and to be able to live in that and sort of think about ourselves and our relations and our values and our goals and our projects within the context of where we actually are, instead of the sort of fantasy, picture of floating free from the earth and the abstract human and the abstract planet that with resources and so on, that we sort of operate within there to all these catastrophic, results. So those are some things that, I just thought about in responding to, thinking about the what Dennis said and what Gordon said. I mean, I could talk on forever, but I want to give, there's more things that the panelists want to say if we want to open up for their discussion soon.
Would you mind if I got a little bit combative?
Sure.
Not toward you, but one of the things, there's a term that happened here that I'm not sure I understand. There was a point where we were talking about interconnectedness, and somebody pointed out, and I forget who it was, that there were some resonances or some similarities with Christianity or something. Anyway, so Christianity was brought in, and then we segued on into the universal sacred. And the thing is, I want to make a really clear point here that Christianity is absolutely not into the universal sacred. That of course one of the huge problems that we have, and of course earlier Dennis specifically said that Christianity may be, or probably, arguably is the bigger problem, because Christianity is actually what informs all of our laws and everything. When the Europeans separate themselves from the land and seek universal truth, they also separate themselves from their own backgrounds and don't realize that everything that they do is embedded in a particular worldview, embedded in a particular history, embedded in their own, in a sense, indigeneity. Okay, but of course it's a non-localized, right? So the thing is that Christianity, specifically, for example, the Catholic Church doctrine concerning animals and animal cruelty and so on. The bottom line is that according to the Catholic Church, animals don't have souls. And the only reason why we have any duty to them is because of the possibility that in learning cruelty to them, we learn cruelty to humans, that we kind of mistake humans and animals, and we end up becoming cruel toward humans, or a secondary duty because we have a duty to the human that owns the animal or whatever. But the animal's only path to God is through humans. And of course, the earth is specifically non-sacred. Okay. The greater world is the world to come. So already this earth is devalued to the point of nothingness. The earth is nothing in Christianity. Okay, the earth is what we're trying to get out of and go on to whatever it is that God has planned or whatever. So the thing is that from my perspective, and I hopefully I'm not getting too combative or whatever, but those elements of Christianity end up meaning that there's absolutely no way that the universal sacred can get in. Anyway, I guess I'll just go ahead and stop there and see if anyone else has something to say about that. Gordon, Dennis, Lorraine, since you haven't talked a lot yet, Lorraine may be the one to respond.
Respond to you, Lee?
What's that?
To respond to you, Lee?
Yeah.
Ah. Unfortunately, I think I believe you. Unfortunately, I really do see sacred. I always talk about it as sacred with a capital S and sacred with a small s. And Christianity is divided their big S. That's the problem. They've divided it and they've situated it in certain places, right? God, even the Pope, bishops, whatever. That's
Right.
the big S in their view. But I think that everything belongs to the small s in the whole universality of it all, or maybe the way Brian, Brian, oh my goodness, is going at it in terms of relationality. I truly believe that, and I agree with him. Like, there's no criticism. Trying to think about this from like a feminist viewpoint. I just was told I'm the only female, and not really sure. Having missed so many voices, I'm really disappointed, and I'm at a little bit of a loss as where to come in, except that it's really good to see you, Lee. And I think that Christianity and, formal religion in any sense has already taken a firm hold on people's beliefs, their ideology, their ideas, everything. And I'm not sure if it was Gord or Dennis, but one of them said, where do we go with this? How do we get this out to other people? How do we get people to understand this beyond just this little, tiny group of people? And we're a very small group of people. How do we get this beyond, unless we start hauling Brian all over the country, and bring him to Canada to visit?
I mean, I think just to carry on this conversation, which has taken an interesting turn. I mean, we can go back to this original discussion we had half an hour ago with Brian about the voices that he's putting through the text, and there's this sense that you get in parts of a number of chapters that one thing that an Indigenous philosopher might be trying to achieve is some sort of recognition of their work as acceptable within the field of philosophy. And I'm always worried about that. I mean, I think it's, a project that has some merit to it, but has to be done very carefully, because I'm concerned about this whole politics of recognition that has become very prevalent up here in Canada. There's a lot of the language within the legal community and the political science community is about the need for the Canadian state to recognize Indigenous peoples as equal partners in confederation, all this kind of stuff. But it seems as though it's really turning the conversation over to something that isn't fruitful in the long term. Because ultimately what Canada wants is for there to be some new kind of federal package where Indigenous authority is buried within the state. That's the kind of recognition they're willing to acknowledge. Like, we'll recognize you as quasi-provincial or something like that. We'll give you some authority. And the recognition battle then ends up really leaning toward a deep form of assimilation. And I think the same thing can be said about this conversation about Christianity. There's a lot of movement in Canada toward coming up with some reconciliation between Indigenous spirituality and Christianity. But it ends up being Indigenous spirituality embedded within Christianity.
Yes.
And that just, what's that going to accomplish? It's actually just the end of Indigenous spirituality, really, because of the way in which Christian religion has functioned for the last couple thousand years, or at least last 1,500 years.
yeah, something I was thinking about in this conversation. So this relates to, I mean, I usually sort of share this in the context of, even thinking about healing and trauma and so on, most particularly. But I think that it relates here as well, and it kind of relates to, I know, ways that people in Canada, particular, have been thinking about, what sovereignty means, what kind of Indigenous futures mean, not as sort of recognition, but as something that comes from Indigenous people and Indigenous traditions in and of itself, right? Not something that comes from the recognition. And the metaphor that I use, I use it as a metaphor, but it comes from a real thing. So I have some friends out here in South Dakota, a family that I'm kind of Hunka related to, that I go out to their Sundance every summer. I've done it for, help just support their Sundance at Thunder Valley for about 15 years now. And, when they keep that fire going, just like a lot of people do for ceremonies, you have a ceremony, you start the fire goes throughout the ceremony. That's part of it. And you can talk a lot about what that means and the different ways that people use it and talk about it. What's relevant here is just keeping the fire going. It's a practical matter. The fire going in the context of, some very bad weather sometimes, right? Yeah. So I remember the first time I saw this happen, and it just hit me in a certain way, and it stuck with me. And I think about this as a metaphor for these kinds of things. So one time, it's kind of getting down closer to evening, and you could just see those thunderclouds from the west just building up. We were going to get a storm. It ended up being a supercell. It was a serious storm. Knocked a bunch of teepees over. It was, pretty bad in the end, but they could see that coming. There's some bad weather coming, and you got that fire going. What do you do? Do you try to protect it, right? Try to put something around it to, this fire is okay, keep it here, protect it. No, what they did is just built it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until, the fire was, 50 foot high in the sky. It was the biggest fire I've ever seen. That rain came through, didn't touch it. That fire kept going, right? Because it wasn't about keeping it, that's like the recognition. This is okay. We're going to protect this. There's a metaphor for this for all kinds of stuff, how we think about the environment and national parks and, every kinds of thing like that. But this sort of, this idea that maybe what you ought to be doing is not, waiting for, the recognition or seeking that recognition, but just building from the capacity that you have and the knowledge you have and the, kinship that you have and the, all that comes from your ancestors and all the things that we rely on in Indigenous people in particular places and times to build rather than, wait and look for help and sort of protection from that framework of recognition. And this relates perhaps in the context particularly of the book and this kind of work as, kind of pointing back to, the questions that Lee was asking, that, maybe the time is really right to, just move forward with this, right? And build these things in the way that, we can to make the fire stronger rather than constantly kind of try to balance, the recognition and what people should bring everyone along with us, just build the fire and, kind of like if you build it, they will come or something like that, as a model for thinking about this rather than the other way around. That's just a thought that I had. We want to open up to other
Yes.
questions from the audience and stuff.
Yes,
Or
I do think it's time to open it up for questions, Brian.
okay. I know that there was one person that put a question in Q&A already that says, I'd be interested to hear more about Brian's understanding of the correct approach to the problem of delocality and how it differs from standpoint theory or situated knowledge. And I could just say something about that to get the question and answer started. I mean, mostly it's kind of the way that we think about what locality is from the perspective of standpoint theory or kind of situated knowledge, at least in the sense that the critique is really just this, that oftentimes when we think about that way of embedding, we're starting from, trying to put a framework that is delocalized and trying to just pinpoint something within it, still accepting the kind of delocalized framework and just trying to pinpoint something specific in there to kind of, situate it rather than, taking it out of the abstract and putting it into the particular. But my problem is that still accepts a framework of delocality, that in order to really think about locality, I know, and part of it is the use of this term locality. After I wrote the book, I really kind of stopped using it because I think it just kind of confuses people because they just think about like situated, like localizing, putting a pin on something, like situating it, rather than thinking about what's really happening here is not that, but that we're always already in it, realizing and recognizing our embeddedness. That is something we never lose and can only falsely ever abstract into something beyond that. And so it's not really, there's pieces of that in the way we talk about standpoint theory or situated knowledge. It's not a binary thing, but it's sort of that we need to kind of conceptualize how we talk about situated knowledge or situating stuff from a perspective of this way that we're kind of embedded in the land and relationality as a kind of always already in motion facet of our, being in the world at the most fundamental level. I don't know if that helps much, but that's something. Sandra had a question. There are other questions. I'm sorry to moderate my own discussion.
Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, Sandra supposedly has her hand up, but
She does, but she also said she would wait till others, but
Okay.
if Sandra's the only one with her hand up, let's go ahead. I can't see
Yeah.
everybody. Go ahead,
Am I
Sandra.
allowed to ask a question yet?
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Thank you, Lorraine. Oh, I really don't know where to begin because you have all touched on something that has made me despair for so many years, that you would have to try to break through the glass ceiling of or the cement wall of Western philosophy in order to publish what you want to say. And one of the things that I've been thinking about since we had this symposium at the CPA is that philosophy departments, and I can only speak for philosophy, philosophy departments are really like cement walls. I've been looking at job advertisements because I wouldn't mind being hired. I won't because I'm too old. But looking at the advertisements has taught me something that is kind of interesting. Philosophy is hiring. The University of Alberta is hiring, and they are really interested in having an Indigenous philosopher. But they want this Indigenous philosopher to do a whole lot of other stuff. Sorry, calm. And this is not the way to advertise for an Indigenous philosopher. But how do you get to philosophy departments? How do you show them that they, someone in this group, probably you, Brian, said earlier that you use the analogy of having to break through Western philosophy that sees itself as philosophy, right? So that you have to fit in to Western philosophy. Why would you want to? And it's not fair that you have to. One of the things that would be great if it could happen is that instead of a Native Studies department, Dennis, you could start a Native Philosophy department, right? Or Indigenous philosophy, or whatever you want to call it, because I know Leroy Littlebear, for example, he doesn't like the notion of philosophy because it is so narrow that almost by definition, we are exclusive. So one of the things that I wanted you to talk about is giving ways to, I'm assuming that every philosopher that joined here today is really got an interest in Western philosophy. So how could we as Western philosophers be opening the door for Indigenous voices to thrive rather than suffer under philosophy? Because you all describe suffering. Lorraine hadn't had a chance to talk, but you can read Cries from a Métis Heart and you get another story of how professional philosophers own departments in ways that are so exclusive. We can talk about church too, because they're equally bad, but I'd like to hear you talk about philosophy for a few minutes.
Someone else other than me want to talk about that? Lorraine, you want to?
Yeah,
something
can you
about
hear
that?
me?
Yeah. you
I'm
can.
muted. Oh my gosh, there we are.
Yeah.
I had to use another computer. Sandra, one of the problems that I'm finding here at BU is I do teach Indigenous philosophy. The lack of interest is phenomenal. It's horrible. They had to cancel my class this fall because I only had 2 students registered. And that's really sad. But what happens is the students come to me, both native and non-native alike, right? And because they teach it so different, it's not as acceptable as it would be for the native students. Native students, on the other hand, can't grapple, or they're having a difficult time with the terminology that we use. So I try not to use it. Then the Western students don't think that this is real philosophy. And since you mentioned, and I have to go there, cries, many years ago, Lee, do you remember, this was a private conversation, Lee said, okay, Lorraine, now that you've done this book, now you have to do real philosophy. Do you recall that, Lee?
Oh, well, I will tell you, that was actually at the book, that was actually at the
last meeting?
APA. Yeah, I mean, I actually did that in the review, and partly, of course, I was channeling Viola.
Yeah.
And I specifically referenced Viola.
Yeah.
And the thing is that I felt horrible. I mean, that was very emotional. It was emotional for you. It was emotional for me.
Yeah.
It was very tough. It was very tough. And, you know, I don't know if going back, if I would retract it, if I would alter it. I mean, there were facts that I didn't know about your book, you know, because you were pressed to make the book more, you know, to make the book more one way, you know, to make it less philosophical. And the thing is, I was unaware of that. You know, so you actually had had a press that was willing to let you go ahead and produce something, you know, that was that they wanted something less philosophical. And and you know, so the thing is, I was unaware of all of that, and I'm very sorry. You know, I don't think I ever got to tell you that.
No, thank you. That has haunted me.
The thing is, you know, we you know, the thing is, we love each other. Okay, I mean, you're in my heart.
Always, I
Um,
know.
Yeah.
But it's just one of those things as an Indigenous philosopher, right? I took it to heart, and I've been trying to figure out how to do this without harming indigeneity. And, you know, I'm really glad, Brian, that you did what you did. And even Shay, I don't know if Shay's here today. I wish she was. Your writings are, I don't want to say Western. I don't want to. I've taken a totally different tack, I guess. Sandra knows I've done this. I've started to write differently. I can't, I cannot seem to write well, like Brian and Shay, for example, but I can story tell. And that's what I do now. I tell stories. And to me, that's an Indigenous methodology for philosophical conversation. So I recently had one where I had Wisagajak encountering Rene Descartes. Nowhere through that conversation would you know that that's who Wisagajak was talking to. Nowhere, but it got the message across, I hope, at the end. So this is what I started doing, Brian, because I don't see myself able to accept the way the Western world wants. And Gordon also had a huge influence on me way back when, Gord, when I was just a grad student.
We were kids.
My first year grad, yeah, that was impressionable. But when you said, you were talking about how to talk about philosophy, and I cite you every time, but that was a real interesting question for me. How do we talk about it without recentering the Western world? So I found the only way I could do it is to tell these stories. So I do it a little bit different, but my students, the Indigenous students, understand that methodology. They understand when I'm bringing in the ancient narratives, and we get to analyze them. But one of the things in going all the way, sorry, I'm talking too much. One of the things going all the way back to Christianity is I've even had Indigenous students yell at me because the Christian mindset, I want to say it like that, and I'm not going to say just Catholic, right? But the Christian mindset really has infected everybody, from our lawyers to, our band councils. Dennis, well, there's another one of my teachers, right? That I'm battling so much up here in Canada that I finally said, you know what, I'm going to do it my way. You want to talk about indigenizing? Well, I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to just tell stories all the time. So it's good that I'm closing to retirement, because otherwise they'd probably find a way to get rid of me. Anyhow, that's how I see Indigenous philosophy from up here in the north, and how to combat it. I know it's not the right way. I know it's not the Western accepted way, of the argument, construct the argument, and blah, blah, blah. I weave argument into my story, Gord. At least I hope so. Thank you.
One thing I
Dennis,
just
yeah.
kind of connecting together some of the things that have been said overall, right? You see this problem that several people have described of, trying to find this middle ground, and like, I'm not, Indian enough for the Indians, I'm not white enough for the white people, or I'm too white for the Indians, and all this kind of thing of trying to do this, and recognizing the common struggle, right? That that's sort of a part of what we're doing, particularly in the academy. And of course, there's other places where this exists too, perhaps, that there's this thing that is just a part of what we have to deal with. But then, I like for me, kind of learning from this and thinking about what I'm putting together from what people have said, thinking about the ways that we can worry less about, trying to fit in and doing things that really empower us, that empower, these ways of thinking, like the building of the fire kind of metaphor as the future that we ought to put all our chips down on. That's what I learned, at least, seems like.
Can I riff on something that Lorraine just kind of mentioned, the band council thing? One of the sad things, and I don't necessarily mean to push this off in a direction, maybe just me saying this is enough. But one of the sad things is that because of history and because of how our tribal nations have evolved over time, in many instances, our own governments are antagonistic toward our own traditions, and in fact are irrelevant, if not antagonistic, at the very least irrelevant, to the continuation of what makes us Indian, and maybe should even be gotten rid of. But anyway, and the thing is that Gordon, of course, is a scholar of the law, as is Dennis. I'm not quite there, but of course, what I've written about a lot is the law, and the thing is that I'm afraid that that the structures that we operate within, even as Indigenous people, even within our own structures, in many cases harms us. Anyway, I just throw that out.
You're muted, Lorraine. You're still muted. I can't hear you, Lorraine.
There we go.
There we go.
Someone else to unmute me. I was just going to say, Viola always said we're in a Western institution, so we chose to come here. We need to do it their way. I wonder what she would say today. And I did look. We have a question here from Pedro. He wanted to see if we could talk more about the Trickster framework. I leave that one to you, Brian. My Trickster is Wisakajack, but.
So, I mean, I think that relates very much to what we're trying to say, right? Because, there's, the different ways of approaching this conversation, trying to be more than a message, or to talk about these things in a particular context, right? There's, for me, the Trickster kind of framework, or just thinking, I don't really have a formal, I sometimes talk about like the Trickster methodology or Trickster framework as if it were something kind of formally documented. I mean, to me, it's just kind of, there's ways of talking and communicating that I'm familiar with that have this kind of, not only the Trickster narratives, the Trickster stories, but even kind of, even the way that we joke with each other, or kind of our tricksters with each other in ordinary settings. There's a dynamic there that is about kind of pushing our buttons or pulling on our coat strings a little bit, kind of unraveling things for us. There's different metaphors that you might use in different Trickster contexts. If you're thinking about Ikitome, the spider trickster, or you're thinking about coyote or other things, there might be different ways that you talk about this. But, with the Ikitome, right, the spider trickster, think about the webs and the, pulling on our strings and the ways that we get ourselves wrapped in our own webs, and the things that we learn from this, from a Trickster kind of narrative or a Trickster framework, is a kind of, we're given some perspective through story or through narrative of some sort. We're given a kind of perspective of our own, positionality, or even the webs that we've wrapped ourselves in. We can kind of, it's like looking in the mirror, right? Like the Trickster kind of framework allows you a certain kind of view of yourself, right? You get to, oh, who's that guy right there? Holy cow, what? He's all covered in spider webs and like tripping over himself and upside down, and his hair's all disheveled. What's going on with that guy, right? That's kind of, you get that kind of, moment, or that's the goal, I think, at one level. So how that sort of, makes sense within the context that we're describing is that it's a way of, we talk about all these kinds of balances, particularly the kind of, the ways we're communicating oftentimes in the English language, in academic settings, to people who, mostly only speak English, and kind of have a particular, experience and way of seeing the world that's kind of framed by those experiences and that language and that, history of Western thought. And by using this, we're able to, communicate something more than what we're communicating, right? That just the words that we're saying are not just here's like a story. It's sort of giving something else that allows for us to kind of, like Gloria Anzaldúa says, like border thinking, right? It's sort of like we're able to kind of, give people a sort of, we're over there in a certain world, a kind of, not a glimpse of us, but a glimpse of themselves sort of from our perspective in a certain way, right? And I think that's a really powerful kind of, dynamic of resituating ourselves, both in terms of trying to think about a way of doing Indigenous philosophy, at least in this, complex place that we exist in of, Western institutions, but also a way of sort of talking about these things in narrative forms, whether they're talks or they're books or articles, that helps to be more than just a message, to have something else that it carries with it. So those are the things that I think about the Trickster framework.
Sandra posted here a question. Does Indigenous ethics get in the way of being critical of the aspects of Western philosophy that are constraining Indigenous philosophy's access to philosophy departments and Indigenous philosophers being regarded as doing real philosophy? And I actually wanted her to explain to me what she's calling Indigenous ethics before we get a chance to answer, right? What do you mean, Sandy?
Okay, well, it's sort of what Brian is doing in his book and what you and I have done. I just sum it up with all my relations ethic.
Yeah, okay.
And the kind of ethic that Gordon is presuming we better have, or we're going to just destroy everything.
Okay. Okay, I'll let Brian take your question here.
So here's my thought, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts about this too. So my first, just kind of responding to it, putting it in a context of my own experience, and what just like responding to the idea of the question, maybe not sort of in an all-encompassing way, but so for example, like there are two different places where I've seen this kind of thing. At least this is the specific version of kind of Indigenous ethics that I want to talk about, at least for a minute. The idea of of sort of humility and respect and so on, right? So friend of mine, Cornell, who was at Portland State for a long time, the director of Indigenous Nation Studies. He's retired back in Oklahoma.
Are we talking about Cornell Peeble-Wardy?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
He used to say even there that, like we don't want to, we let, kind of, we don't want to sort of put ourselves out there. We need all these things from our department, like, well, the other people are asking for stuff, like we'll let them have it, right? Because they seem like they're in need. It's a kind of, an Indigenous ethics who's operating even within the academy, right? And he sort of has talked about, the limitations of that, like even toward the end of his career, like there's got to be a point where we're like, we're sorry, we've kind of, stood back and let other people go forward for so long. It's our turn. We're going to have to say, no, we need to go first this time, rather than always like, you go first, you need this, you go first, right? And I see this even in Oklahoma now, at the University of Oklahoma. There's kind of two different student groups that are kind of splintered off. right? Because they're the student groups that are real active and real boisterous and activist. And then the ones that like, no, we don't do that. We don't really talk about ourselves. We don't talk about problems. We don't gripe. We don't say, oh, the university, we don't talk about the state of Oklahoma and the settler this or that. We just kind of keep our head down. And within that framework, of course, you could analyze some of kind of going back to what we said, kind of certain kinds of internal colonization, kind of accepting of certain, ethical frameworks as indigenous, Christian kinds of things or whatever. But I think that that's still too simple. I think there really is sort of a problem, even if you sort of say some of this comes about from people just like in Oklahoma, we keep our head down. We don't want our head blown off, right? Just kind of keep your head down, don't cause any problems, so that you can survive. But there is something more about, there's something deeper here that's going on that Sandra sort of talks about that I think is a challenge. And maybe it's sort of, Dale Turner talks about it as the word warrior kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe there's, there's specific kinds of personalities or, people, roles, however you want to talk about this, that, can take up and ought to take up the more combative sort of frameworks of this, right? That some people can't. Don't feel, there's lots of things I don't feel comfortable with saying, right? I just never would say, even though it's true, right? I'm not going to say it because it's just like, I'm not, I'm just not going to say that to someone, even if, that's, unless there are certain sort of, situations where I would say it, but a lot of stuff I'll just like, whatever, just let them say that crap and like, just move on and don't sort of take it on. So, I mean, those are just some of my thoughts. It's not really an answer, but kind of accepting that this is a problem and some kind of initial thoughts about it if other people have things they think about.
When it comes to Indigenous ethics, there's so much going on. We've already covered the whole Christian thing and all the rest of it. What I always have to ask myself is, what would my Nukam say? I know that my teachers, Doug, Dennis, everybody, they all have one way of looking at things and I have another way, but I always have to ask myself, because I when I was doing my dissertation, I wrote a lot of angry stuff. And of course, Scott Pratt would tell me I wasn't being fair and I'd get angry and say, why should I be fair? You weren't fair. But when it came down to it, I wasn't so concerned with my committee as I was with what would my Nukam say? And I realized that, should be ashamed of me. That's my guiding light. Am I saying things in a way that people can hear, or am I just saying things in a way they're going to react? And that was really important. And when it comes to, go back to relationality, because that's my favorite thing, right? All our relations, what exactly does that encompass? What does that really mean? We all have different ways of approaching it. So we can be critical, but I agree with Dale, the word warriors. Some of us need to tell stories and some of us need to argue, Gord. We all have different positions to take, and that's important. And I don't think that we should let, at least my personal opinion is, we should not let others dictate the way that Indigenous people speak about Indigenous philosophy. It's our choice how we speak about it, not the academies, not anybody else. So if we want to argue, then go for it, argue. I believe that my grandmother and my great-grandmother, I should say, liked to scream when their children didn't do right. So I don't have that passive, soft voice that, Native people, Indigenous people are supposed to have. I don't have it and I don't want it. I'm in the 21st century here, but I believe that my grandmother in the 18th century was the same way, regardless of the people that want to say, oh, we talk in whispers now because, we're Indigenous. We need to be. I don't believe in that. Anyway, that's me going on my rant again about indigeneity. The key was we all have our own voices and we need to be able to use them without total condemnation by others. If they're going to condemn us, oh, well, we still have to say what we have to say. Dennis, you're laughing.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, whether I'm still muted here or not, but what the hell does it matter? I guess is my question. Right. And what I use in class, and I just have to again show this, right? Is I have this little thing that when kinds of stories. So and there's lots of it in the world, right? So there's certainly lots of it. But like I say, go back to, and you're talking about your kukum, and you talk about my dad along the same line.
Mhm.
And that and you know, and we tend to forget, certainly place high emphasis on education getting us out of this, right? So and our education is, you know, in more ancient times whereby modeling rather than by shaping. Right?
Mhm.
So and my dad used to tell me, on occasion, actually quite a few occasions, that if you can't put your best effort into it, don't do it. Right? And there's consequences to that, you know, whether it be immediate and hurting yourself or
Mhm.
your job and stuff like that. And at the other, and you know, on the other side of the coin, where you're talking about, you know, the thought process itself, we walk this earth individually, right? In our own being, and yeah, we have, you know, all my relations and stuff like that, but all my relations aren't necessarily pleasing, right? Or complimentary and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I kind of you know, live by the philosophy in that direction is if you don't like me, I don't give a shit. Right? Because you're not liking me is not my problem. It's your problem. Right? So maybe we can get into a discussion and get a better understanding and stuff like that, but it's not going to keep me awake. So, you know, taking those kinds of things and what we're talking, I think what we're discussing right now is how do we break down these, you know, glass ceilings? How do we get in the door of philosophy?
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's a redundant argument. You know, it goes back to you know. Right? So you know, whether you know the tenured philosophers in the philosophy department at Lakehead University like me or not, I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
Whether they want me to speak in their classes or not, I don't give a shit. All right. And you see this, I think, in a grander scale of how we've progressed along this line, particularly, like I say, particularly in academia. Indigenous studies, native studies, falling into this bailiwick of decolonization and indigenization and reconciliation, right? And it's across the country. You know, it's not just one place; it's across the country. It's a political movement that's kind of like dragging along an empty barrel, right? If I drag along an empty barrel, I'm not going to get drunk on anything that's in the barrel. Right? There's nothing there. And that's how I see reconciliation, etc. There's a lot of politics to it. Where's the content?
Uh-huh.
Right? And I see these programs discussing Indigenous law. Now, the latest one last week, Metis law. And I say to myself, and I don't mean to be offensive, but I say to myself, holy fuck, when is it ever going to end? Because we're trying to apples and oranges type thing, fitting my indigeneity into a constitutional monarchy.
Yes.
Right? And we've gone so far, we actually have an Indigenous person as the Governor General of Canada, who's the representative of Queen Elizabeth. Think about it. While her community is arguing for their sovereignty and their self-determination and their self-governance. And everybody goes, we were bribed. All right? 71 people, 71 First Nation people ran for a position in the House of Commons in the last election. 71. In the days of old, and I was there, where the sign said, no Indians allowed.
Mhm.
Yeah, we couldn't drink in a beer parlor. We couldn't vote in an election. Why this change of heart in it all? Why this change of heart? Right? So if we're going to address this, we have to address this from our position, i.e. education, yes, but not within the system that exists. And we have, think about this. We're all happy, we have all these programs in colleges and universities, Indigenous this, Indigenous that, and all that kind of stuff. We actually even have our own institution, right? It's called First Nations University of Canada, right? I refer to it as fuck university.
And you.
That's exactly what it's doing, right? So when they, when they christened it, who christened it? The grandson of Queen Victoria. They didn't have any elder from the community come forward. Matter of fact, when the elders from the community came forward, they got the big battle. And guess who won? University of Regina. That's where you get, that's where you get the certification from. You don't get it from the First Nation community. You don't get it from Indigenous people. You're learning the white gobbledygook in your program. Yeah, it's going to take time. There is a social movement, in the works. Maybe a little bit adrift at a particular time, but certainly we see people, we see people doing things. Like say when I back in the day when I went to law school, right, and Gord was running around the country trying to find himself, right? There were only about 60, 70 of us with law degrees back then. Now it's in the hundreds. Right? And this is, from my mind, I've got, degrees in philosophy, social work, and law, trying to figure all this out. And the law is one of the main invigorators of everything that happens to us. Right? And we accept it. What people argue, repeal the Indian Act. No, don't repeal the Indian Act. Invite people to become Indians. Matter of fact, the possibility is there because it's the Indian Act that makes me special. Right? If I were not a status Indian, I'd be like any other ordinary citizen. Right? And that's what all this push is about, to make us all just like any other ordinary citizen. At the end of the day, it satisfies the land question. Okay? Then there's no question about title deeds anymore. There's no cloud over them of Aboriginal title, any of that. And it raises the viability of investing in Canada. Right? And what do we get out of it? Nothing. Right? Nothing, because we not only sold out the land, we sold out ourselves. So whether the philosophy department accepts me or not, I couldn't care less. It would be nice if they did. But if they don't, I'll walk down the hall as Doug says, being invisible. Yeah, I'll walk down the hall being invisible, and I'll laugh all the way. But I'm not going to spend any time crying about it. I'm going to talk to my students, and my students are the ones who are going to make the shift. There's one on the screen right here, right? So, and there's others, right? So that's where the shift is going to come from. Students realizing their own situation and working at it. And it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
We took 500 years to get here. It might take a couple years to get back.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my rant.
Anyone else? Oh, Linda Holder has asked a question. Is private property as bad as religion has been previously discussed?
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Come on, all Western property views derive from Christianity. The bottom line is God granted man dominion over the earth, transferred title to Christians. Okay, because of course Christians are the only ones that God would transfer title to. And of course that leads to the doctrine of discovery and so on that Gordon or Dennis or probably just about any other Indigenous scholar could go on at great length about. So the thing is, it really is all the same thing. And the thing is that they'll ignore things. I mean, Dennis brought up treatise of government, Locke. The thing is that yes, Locke goes to great pains to talk about how Indians can only own the deer that they shoot, but not the land that they hunt the deer on. Okay, so he talks about all of that stuff, likens us to fishermen who we may own the fish, but you can't own the ocean. Okay, but then later on in the second treatise of government, he actually ends up pointing out that this is just the beginning of property. What he describes is just the beginning. He then says, but once a system of land tenure has been developed, that then becomes the law of the land. Well, Indians had a system of land tenure. Okay, we knew whose land was whose. Okay, and we knew that none of us really, it was there. Okay, but what do? They go ahead and ignore that. Okay, so yes, there was a system of land tenure, but that wasn't good enough for them. They got their own system of land tenure and they swooped it in on us. Okay, and of course that system of land tenure is exactly rooted in Christianity. Too bad. Okay, it's the same thing.
I think it's a myth as well, Lee. I think this whole private property thing is a myth. You can purchase land, but you sure as heck can't do what you want on that land. So I think this whole private property thing, somebody's got to look at it from that angle that, you know what, I bought a house. I have a beautiful, huge yard. I could put up teepees there. I could put up sweat lodges, but you know what? I wouldn't be allowed to. Community wouldn't allow it.
Well, and the bottom line is we're going to die. Okay.
We're going to die.
I own the land and I'm going to die. Does the land suddenly cease to exist because I die?
I'm going to sell it. I'm going to sell it. I'm going to sell it. I'm tired of paying taxes and every other thing for it.
Lorraine, you have to be careful because if you reverse that, you go to the reserve, then none of what you said applies because there's no private property on reserve.
That's true. Yeah. It's an interesting thing to look at what private property means, right?
Well, that is one of the great
back
things.
to Locke. I don't want to go back to Locke. True, I can have a house and I can have the land and I can pay all the utilities and all the bills and all the rest, but I am limited. There was up here in Canada, I don't know if you know this with Brian, but someone did put a sweat lodge on their property and it was the Indigenous people that flipped out and demanded that it be removed. There's your Christian impact, Dennis. That was up in your part of the world in Ontario. I laughed when I saw it. I went, wow, now this is really a telling thing. When our own people say you cannot have that on in your yard.
Actually, Sanders asked a question that I think Gordon and Dennis need to dig into about underlying title, because the thing is that it's not exactly the same here in the United States. I mean, there's some differences there, and I really would like to hear what Dennis and Gordon have to say about underlying title.
She wants to know if underlying title is a myth.
And take a stab at it, Dennis, or let me jump in.
Gordon, go ahead.
You teach it.
Well, I don't teach it as a myth. It depends what you mean by myth, because it is a kind of a fable in that there's nothing in the world that corresponds to it. But we as humans can make up things that become parts of the world. So I don't know if the expression myth really captures the essence of it. I mean, we as in people in the West have created a system of understandings that then guide our behaviors. And so it's something in the world that exists. Underlying title, for example, is something that structures Canadian law. So it can't be mythical in the sense that there's nothing there. There's something there. It's just a story that was developed over the course of centuries and became the foundation for a social system of rules and principles. in the larger picture, of course, it's on very shaky foundations because it presumes that the land that was discovered under the doctrine of discovery wasn't inhabited by peoples who had their own systems of relating to the land. So there is an understanding in the Canadian system that there's a game being played that is fraudulent. So I'd say fraudulent might be a better term than a myth. But there is an end game in place to try and remove that fraudulent aspect, which is what Dennis and a few others have been talking about the last 20 minutes or so. Just if you get Indigenous peoples to see themselves as just particular kinds of citizens of Canada, then you will have removed that problem with underlying title, because everybody will think the same way. If everybody thinks the same way, then you've gotten rid of that blemish. So it's really about, the fact that people have developed a way of thinking. It just hasn't encompassed the group of people that were here before that system came into being.
Is that it?
Yep.
Okay, my turn.
Oh, goodness.
Okay, underlying title, right? Underlying title. So when we look at the land title system in Canada, that we have in Canada, it actually goes back to the beginning of time. All right. And if you know what the beginning of time is, and we have two systems in Canada. We have the British system, and we also have the French system. All right. So the beginning of time for the British system is 1066. And that's when Uncle Bill got in his rowboat and rowed across the English Channel and kicked the shit out of his brother. Right? So what comes out of that is this whole notion of season, right? So we have, in the practical sense of conflict with land in today's world, we have a couple of ways of addressing that. One through a negotiation through the courts, and eventually, if there's no settlement of all that, you go to war, right? And then you conquer the other side. Then you claim title to it. Well, we haven't come to that point yet, right? We haven't come to that point yet. So when the colonizers came here and established a land tenure system, they brought the Metis system with them, which worked very well in southern Ontario. It didn't work very well in Quebec because the French already had their system there. And then McDonald comes along in 1867 and says, "I'm going to, build this railroad from the east coast to the west coast," and says, "Oh my God! Once we get north of Barrie, we've got a problem, which is we don't have underlying title. So we got to get out there and start making treaties." Right. So the driving force behind that be the principle in law that you don't build your shit house on your neighbor's property, right? Because if you do that, then once you put that last nail in, then your neighbor owns your shit house. You don't own it, right? So that's the impact of underlying title. So still hearing today that when we get to fee simple, a fee simple is simple. Either you pay the tax or within 2 years. If you regulate within 2 years, then you get off, send the sheriff over and you get off the land, right? So that's basically fee simple. So it's a title deed from the Crown based upon season, and season, I'm sure Gord could tell you that season could be a good full course credit in law school by itself, right? So when it gets down to us now, there's that underlying title of season which hasn't been resolved, but what's impacted that is Aboriginal title. So Aboriginal title being like a cloud over fee simple, right? So where does this go to? So Aboriginal title, unlike fee simple is private property, as we talked about Locke and whatnot, and private ownership. Aboriginal title, it belongs to the group called Indigenous. So it's an indigeneity, and it will be in existence unless it's negotiated out of the way. It will be in existence because it's a communal interest as long as there's one Indigenous person left alive. Okay? Once there's no more indigenous people, then it will disappear. But at the present time, it places a cloud over fee simple in Canada, right? In that there's a good portion of Canada that haven't resolved that, and it's not clear who owns the land. Is it the claim of Canada or is it the indigenous people? Does that help, Bert?
I guess I'll say one of the things that makes us different here in the United States is that we have this great individual, John Marshall, who actually really didn't mince words. He said the truth in many instances about Aboriginal title and so on. And of course, our version is a little bit different from yours. But the thing is that he specifically in Johnson versus McIntosh basically quickly looks at Christianity or religion as being a justification for asserting title to the land. So he briefly mentions that and then he dismisses it. He also mentions Lockean notions of property, and he specifically ends up citing Locke's treatise of government. Okay, so he actually cites Locke. Okay, though he doesn't bring any or much of Locke into the discussion, he cites him. And so he kind of considers the possibility that Lockean property notions gives them the right to take the land. And then he says, and let's see here, I thought I had that right. Let's see here. Let's see here. Oh, so I'm sorry. I thought that I had that right up here. He says, the United States then has unequivocally acceded to that great and broad rule by which its civilized inhabitants now hold this country. They hold and assert in themselves the title by which it was acquired. They maintain, as all others have maintained, that discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy either by purchase or by conquest. Okay, and later on he specifically says that the courts of the conqueror cannot deny the fruits of the conquest. You know, in other words, you know, the bottom line is the United States took it. Too bad, so sad, you're screwed. Okay, and that's the basis of the land title. That's the basis right there. Okay, we took it. Okay, now there's all these fancy theories behind it, but in the end, he says it comes down to conquest and we're the courts of the conqueror. It's beautiful. I love it. You know, I wish every single American had to read the damn thing and had to understand it. Okay, because they seem to think that American title, you know, property is all in the United States. Acquisition of property is all. Okay, and the bottom line is people think that they're secure in their title. Hell no, they're not secure in their title. Under US law, if somebody takes the damn shit, we don't have any way to say that that was wrong. Okay, because we assert that it was right that we took the damn shit from the Indians to begin with. Okay. Anyway, so I think that there's a sense in which we, you know, with Marshall, at least we're way ahead if only people would read the damn stuff and understand it.
Mhm.
I mean, there's no way you can say it's just.
No.
There's a humorous video that you can find online. Everything's online nowadays. So go to YouTube and look for, just do your best attempt at spelling barbecue area.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
so it's barbecue area, put the one word, barbecue. And it's an Australian video. It's about 25 minutes long. It's quite humorous. And it just starts with some Australian Aboriginal people in a boat crossing over this body of water. They come across an area where people having a barbecue. And they ask them, what's this land called? And this is, you know, non-Aboriginal white guy says, yes, this is our barbecue area. So they go, well, we have discovered barbecue area. And they plant their Australian flag, Aboriginal flag. This goes on from there. And that's what Lee was just detailing, was the story of discovery. It's just basically people show up in some part of the world and decide that they claim it. Now behind that is the church again. It's all tangled up with Christianity. The Pope had been issuing papal bulls for, you know, quite a long time before Canada ended up falling under discovery, but it's part of that process. The idea was that only Christians were really possessed of the kind of knowledge of what it is to be full human in the world, so that they were, complete rational beings who could assert themselves around the world. And if you came across a non-Christian population, it was as if there was nobody there. When they were there, they might have their own way of living, but it meant nothing because they didn't understand the word of God. Part of the mission was to give them the word of God. And if they didn't understand the word of God, well, then they were like beasts, which means you could do what you want with them, which in Central and South America meant massive slaughter of people and enslavement of all the rest. And in places like Eastern United States and in Canada, it meant this unfolding of this crazy notion of Christians showing up and claiming a land, and then it becomes theirs. It is really a very crazy history that I think most non-Indigenous people in North America aren't aware of.
Yeah. I use that video, Gord, all the time. All the time. It takes you through the entire colonial process. It shows you residential schools, the taking of the children, everything.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Dennis.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I use it. I've been using it too for about the last 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we should encourage everyone to use that video. It is just a beautiful illustration of, they've turned it around, right? The Aborigines have turned around the whole colonial process, and they show you the ridiculous nature of it,
And
like
it's,
turning major highways. Oh my God, it's just hilarious.
And it's a trickster kind of framework, right?
Totally.
That's
Yes,
kind of
yes.
coming back to the other discussions, like that's when you see these things, just like what Gord was talking about, that there's this absurdity that founds the serious thing that we call law and property law and all this kind of stuff. This absurdity that, if you can just sort of do something to kind of let people see themselves in the mirror for a moment, then they see their own absurdity, right? And
Yeah.
that at least they're then able to move forward in some kind of honest way, like Lee said about Marshall. Marshall was at least like, all right, we're just going to say it. This is how it is. Like, we're going to just go with this. And we know it's absurd, as he says, it's absurd, but it's what we got. And so we're going to stick with it. Like people at least have that choice. It's not just like they're living in this fantasy world that they don't even know they're living in. You have a choice to say, all right, we're going to stick with this and just keep this absurdity. We know it's absurd and we don't care. Or you have a choice to kind of rethink about, to see yourself and see, the absurdity and move in a different way.
Which tells me, goes all the way back to you, Brian, when you talked about Hiktomi and you talked about the spider webs all around and everywhere crazy. And I'm like, yeah, there's the Christian spider web. There's the land spider web, the, underlying title web, all of it. Beautiful. I see Mary McPherson's on here. This is a beautiful illustration for her to do. She's a fabulous artist. But it's absurd. Anyone else? Oh, look at the English language. My this and my that. What is really yours? Pedro's asking, look at the English language. My this and my that. What is really yours?
Point.
My with capital M's. Absolute. My words for sure. Property and things like that. I'm not sure. I think that might be what Pedro's alluding to. Where is he?
Yeah, I think it's just that the looking at kind of making a point about the way English works and thinking about our possession. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Property part of it, that we claim my this, but what does that really mean? My land, as we're saying.
My land.
What does that really mean?
Right.
In terms of possession, what does property really mean? Like we can say even these are my words, and if people respect that, but if they don't, right, they're going to take them and use them and as their own. There's nothing that's really ours in any kind of sense that isn't just framed by some, either ethical constraints or legal constraints, something that, puts that my into some kind of forced compliance.
It seems to me as if going to your book specifically,
Yeah.
in your book, you end up talking about, the radical notion or the radical individuality and radical freedom within what people think of as a very communal existence and so on. And of course, there's a big tension here, and you talk about the tension and so on. But the bottom line is that what we have is what's in us. Okay, that's the only thing that we've got in a sense. And that means that radical freedom is absolutely essential, and I think a key part of Indigenous communities functioning. Okay, because the thing that we really do own is ourselves. We own our thoughts. Okay, and so on. I hope that made some sense.
Yeah.
But isn't even that relational, Lee? Like my words, yes, but my words are informed by Dennis's words, Gordon's words, all the rest of it. So isn't it still relational? We're still part of that, relational universality.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly each one of us is shaped, is formed, but the fact that we're all formed by our environment is a truism, and doesn't alter the fact that each one of us is the author of our own words ultimately. Okay, I still say what I say, and it may correlate to what Brian says or Dennis says or Gordon says, but the thing is, it still ends up being my words. And of course, the thing is that within this radical notion of freedom, is also the fact that we reserve the space for the listener to have their own understanding of what it is that we said. Okay, so the thing is that I throw my words out there and those are mine, but then you have your understanding of those words, which is yours. There's I think a realization within Indian philosophy that of the tenuousness of communication. Communication, I think, is a lot more tenuous than Westerners think that it is. And I think that outside of our interactions with one another, and outside of whether or not our interactions end up being harmonious or not, ends up telling you whether or not whether or not my idea corresponds with your idea. Did that kind of make sense to you?
Yeah.
Kind of. I'm thinking of beadwork.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I see things, right? I create a beaded piece. But, to say that this is my piece alone is an exaggeration, or it's selfish, because I couldn't bead without a teacher teaching me how to bead. I couldn't select the beads without the knowledge of how to select the beads.
Right.
I couldn't even string them together without somebody else. So I find like our stories are like that as well. There's where I talk about that relationality, Brian, that this is not mine, as in my land. It's ours. It's everyone's. But I don't know. My analogy is just beadwork. I find it easier that by the time I get done, explaining how I did all of this and who all was involved in this, everyone else has gone crazy or left.
I mean, I think that there's both in everything, right? There's like, even I think about, like in how I was taught about, sweat ceremony, right? That one of the things that's important about that is that you're giving the water from your body, right? That's the sweat. You're given something that you have to give. Nobody can give your sweat for you, right? But on the other hand, it's not really yours, right? I mean, your body and everything about your body and your ancestors and the environment and everything you ate. So it's never really either or, but like, I think when we talk about mine, at least where I see that, it's about what I can give. It's not about mine in some kind of absolute sense. It's like when I say this is mine, one thing that's important about it is that this is something I can meaningfully give to someone else, that, you know, you can't really take that from me. It doesn't really make sense to like take the land from me. I mean, partially because it doesn't really belong to me in the other sense, you know, but partially because there's something I can say about it that's meaningful in terms of, you know, giving it as a gift or something like that. So I really think it relates to kind of concepts of giving and gifts,
Yeah.
but also, you know, that in that context, you know, there's something meaningful to give, but it's not like it's really yours in these kind of Western notions.
Yeah.
Of property in sort of an absolute way, because nothing really is, as you're saying.
I think that's what I was trying to say with the whole beadwork thing. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. I like your illustration of the sweat. Beautiful.
I think we all need to, I think we also need to keep in mind the thing that Brian talks about as far as colonidity, the colonizer in all of this, that we have an import in our discussions now that weren't there before. Like I say, go back to in time of when I used to attend with my kukum and my aunts, subsequent to good old high mass on at 10 o'clock on a Sunday, right? Where we would come back, you know, and they would take their, probably call it today a medicine bag, right? But they would take their bag, and we all go into, you know, this nice little area in the forest, and spread it out and do our ceremonies. And the reason we went back there again, because you know, it was outlawed, right? But the point of it is that when we talk about my, right, and then there's an import in there of my something, right, my object. And as I understood the language back then, and I've forgotten a lot of it because it's been near on to 70 years before I've talked to anybody with it.
Mm-hmm.
So as I remember, I don't remember, and you know, if you wanted to get into conversation with Indians, you know, they'd start talking in the morning and they wouldn't finish their statement until, you know, late afternoon. You know?
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't couch their conversation in things, you know, in objects, right? And there aren't any law. I don't know of any Indigenous language where you go back in. You know, certainly in today's world, yeah, we talk about, you know, not objects, you know, being imported into the language.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it's you know, say Benz or a new plane or whatever, you know. But none of those things existed back then, right? And even practical things, you know, you talk about beading, you know, did they bead back then, right? Those kinds of things. So evolution and aspect has changed our perceptions of the world considerably, much more so than we like to admit. So we make the argument of being on this scheme of being Indigenous, but in practical reality, we're not too far off of, you know, enjoying our trips to Walmart, you know. So you know, from that perspective, and also with you know, the whole notion of ethics, Indigenous ethics. So Indigenous ethics conjured up in the notions of what's good and what's bad, right? And again, going back to what Brian is saying as far as the respect notion and the history and the future and stuff like that. From my grandparents, I don't understand any of that as quote a being in the world, right? You don't talk about, you know, let's go pick blueberries, right? You don't talk about that, you know, because it's accepted. You don't go and talk about you don't go to pick blueberries until the blueberries are ready to be picked, right? You know, so to do otherwise it's foolish, right? Blah blah blah. And there's more important things to do in life anyway. So whether the things are good or bad are not part of the conversation in indigenous languages. So if you rule out those four things, like, how do you say man in Indigenous life? How do you say woman in Indigenous life? How do you say good? How do you say bad? You can't, okay? You can't. But we, you know, we make up words to fit that because of whatever goat tribe we belong to. So if you're not you know, if you're not available to do that, then your conversation is in that point of time where it just is. Right? So why can't we satisfy ourselves and say it just is, instead of making these, you know, gross plans for tomorrow, which we don't know will ever come, right? Or looking back with sadness on what we did yesterday, which was, that's the choices we made. You know, so enjoying it. So in you know, in the world of that I see, it just is. There is no future. There is no past. It's right now.
Mhm.
Right? Live up and enjoy it. Anyway, that's my 2 cents again.
I appreciate that. I know a lot of the other people on the panel have had the opportunity to, you know, listen to you and have you be their teacher. So I appreciate the opportunity too. I haven't had that, like Lorraine and Lee and Gordon. So I'm really happy for this opportunity just to listen to their, you know, so much good words that you've had to share. Appreciate it.
Well, the thing is that Dennis to me has always been a true elder, in the sense that
Mhm.
he will say things that I absolutely don't understand, may even disagree with, may even react to negatively, and then a year or two later, it all of a sudden makes sense. And the thing is that that's what elders usually do for you. There's an insight that you may not be ready for, okay, but it'll, you know, with luck it'll come to you. And I appreciated the chance to get that from him for the short time that I did.
And I'm lucky to still have it. I was gonna say, Mary, I know you're there. Looking forward to another cup of your tea. Brian, I was thinking, and I know she makes great tea. We need to get together. Like, remember when we used to have our APA meetings, you know, the Indigenous group, we need to have those again. But what I would like to see, being me, and I no longer know who's our chair or anything, but just this kind of thing where we're talking, where we're sharing, as opposed to formal written papers that we have to, you know, articulate and, well, for me, pretend we're great scholars. That the storytelling come together, you know, where you can hear Dennis a lot more. I mean, I can never get enough of listening to Dennis, or even Lee, you know, and Gord. I don't get to see him very often, but, you know, and Doug down there, I know he's listening. But we need to set this up again. I don't know how much time we have today.
Well, and part of it is support. I mean, one of the beauties of Sandra is that Sandra has over time put together venues and brought together the funding to allow us to do a lot of things, you know. And I hearken back to the CSAIP, that committee, the AIP APA committee. I was the chairman one year, okay, and yeah, and the thing is that I was elected chairman. I was going to be chairman for 2 years or whatever the term was, and the next thing you know, I mean, my university wouldn't even provide me with funds to attend the meeting that I was supposed to be chairing it at. So I had ended up just basically resigning from the committee because I didn't have the institutional support, you know. So the sad thing is, you do have to have, and of course, one of the things I'll point out is, you know, somebody mentioned tenure earlier, and tenure isn't even a guarantee of anything. So, you know, we're tenuous in a lot of ways. And having the money and like I said, I want to thank Sandra over time for, you know, having been a person that facilitates exactly what you're talking about, Lorraine.
Yeah. But this is like, on the good side of COVID, which is never good, but this, the ability to come together like this through Zoom, through meetings, it's like, I get to see people, I just, oh my goodness, I can't even tell you how good it is to see you people. Brian, I haven't seen you in years, but that type of thing, and that type of thing doesn't cost money.
Whoa.
It just costs us our time.
Yeah, so one good thing may come out of COVID that we finally understand that this technology works.
Right. Well, I had to fight with it this morning, but yes, it works.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
really got a lot of, I've just started calling you Gord like everyone else does. I don't know if that's appropriate, but I really got a lot out of, I mean, we kind of did the same thing when we spoke before. We just kind of went around and talked, you know, different things that came up. And I mean, I think that's really great. I mean, not only, and there's a number of things, right? Both doing this virtually and we can learn from this in terms of all the traveling and flying and sort of, you know, polluting the air and carbon footprint, all
Right.
that kind of stuff that maybe we can sort of, you know, seriously cut down on and find other ways to communicate and get that energy that we need. Because for me, you know, just being able to go to those meetings as a graduate student back in 1999 when I met Lee, and Lorraine was there
Yeah.
too in 99.
Yeah.
Lorraine was there too.
I
Lorraine
was.
and Lee, and you know, all those people that I met and saw over the years at those meetings, you know, that was just like it was like a ceremony. You know, it was like I was refreshed and
Oh,
ready to
yeah.
go back into the, you know, into the grind and to the battle and all the things that, you know, we have to deal with in our daily life as academics. You know, it just gave me so much to think about and so
Yeah.
much energy. And yeah, we really need those things. So.
And we've lost it. I don't know if it's COVID or what, but we haven't had a meeting in so many years. And you're right, it is refreshing. Like, I don't work in a philosophy department, so you know, I have to get my strength every other place.
Yeah.
So I really miss you guys. That we need to find ways to do this.
Well, I'm the supposed to be, at least I was nominated as the associate chair of the APA committee for this upcoming cycle. So I mean, whatever I can do in that context to kind of support this kind of stuff, but you know, there might be other things we could do too. Not, I mean, you know, to do stuff virtually, but also support it in some kind of way, you know, to, you know, support. We were talking earlier, Lee and Dennis, about the journal.
Yeah.
And maybe even we could sort of think about something, you know, I mean, I'm wearing this hat now as an administrator because I'm the director of the Native Nations Center. So, you know, I have an endowment that I work with, you know, and thinking about those sorts of things. So I've got the kind of, you know, grant proposal hat kind of, you know, on all the time as well. So there might be some ways that we could support some stuff going forward, more than just, you know, like getting on Zoom and getting together, but some funding to support that, where it's sort of, you know, funded research and funding for the journal, let's say. Yeah.
There it is.
And maybe other things too that could come out of this that were productive. You know, I don't mean productive in the literal sense, but also in the literal sense, you know, some written stuff that could have some meaning, you know, so that those are things that I could, you know, definitely be a part of supporting in a number of ways that, you know, I could, you know, in my roles.
Awesome. I tell you, Sandra's really good at getting money. She gets money all the time. I don't know how she does it, but she does it. But it would be really nice once we're able to meet to pull you guys to Canada. You know, we're always traveling to the US. I think you guys need to travel to Canada. Lee misses Thunder Bay.
I do. I do.
Yeah.
It would be, yeah. As a matter of fact, I occasionally, one of the beauties of this technology is things like Google Maps and so on, and actually occasionally drop myself down on the streets you know,
You
in
know?
different places in Canada and kind of look around at the different places that I used to live or, you know, used to anyway. So
Really, we'd really make you welcome, Brian. You need to come to
Yeah,
Canada.
I was
Visit
supposed
us.
to come, I don't know
Yes.
how many times, you know, right around COVID, there was a bunch of different, I was supposed to go to University
Yeah.
of Toronto for something and something else and something else. But, you know, then COVID shut it all down. I'm supposed to go to Rome on
Ooh.
December 13th and 14th to the
Oh.
Vatican of all places, right?
Oh
You
my
know,
gosh.
about this stuff. I'm supposed to go to the Vatican and, you know, for some kind of institute about, you know, justice and well-being that, you know, they thought that I could contribute to. I don't know, but I'm worried about that in terms of, you know, COVID stuff too, that might get shut down, but supposedly on. But the problem is if I get into contact with COVID, they said that the Italian government will quarantine me as long as they feel like it. It could be like a way of capturing me, like sneaking in and get captured by the
Alex.
Catholics. So I'm a
Good luck.
little worried about that, but
You got all our spirits with you.
yeah. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. Sandra, you're relatively quiet. When I keep saying you can get the money, I don't know how you do this, but she's the go-to girl you want.
I had my hand up and you ignored me.
I did.
Oh, we thought your hand was up from before.
Yeah,
I'd
I'm
like
looking at your questions, but
Could I say something about the journal idea?
Yeah.
The Canadian Society for the Study of Practical Ethics has a journal that's online. So, and we pay nothing for that. So you don't need to search for funding for that. You just, you know, you just take it online and go to the University of Windsor and they love you. And you guys could then do what you want to do because you can, well, unless you don't like each other and you're like, I just had an article reviewed by the CSSPE. And I learned from my daughter, Kira, that there is this thing such as the second reviewer. So,
oh my God, yes.
but you have that in an Indigenous country too. But please bring that journal back. It's like the MA that was at Lakehead. We need it, right? We need to have those things, and good luck in doing that. So,
Yeah, Dennis, is there a possibility of us getting that one online? Or do we want to stay
I'd
hardcover?
love to be part of that conversation, but I'm not Indigenous. So if you, but I will talk to you. Anybody who wants to talk to me, you know, I like to talk. So, yes.
I'm an editor as well, so I know that you have to have 2 reviewers, and I know how hard it is to get 2 reviewers.
Yeah.
Is that a Western method?
Of course, everything is Western.
Well, then let's do something different.
Exactly. Actually,
it's-
CSSPE does do something different.
Right.
We always have 2 reviewers, but for
Right.
some reason, Philip and I always arrive at a consensus. So, you know, do the consensus thing. And I suppose it's because we talk to each other, which means peer review doesn't have to be blind, which is also absurd. Anyway. I mean, if I read Lorraine, I read Lorraine. If I read Lee.
Me too. If I read something, I know it was Sandra that wrote it.
Of course you would. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And
There's so few of us that.
thing. I don't know if anybody else, it is 3 o'clock, which probably means we're not allowed to keep you captive anymore. Is that correct, Diane?
it's 2 I think it's 2 Eastern time right now.
It's 1 o'clock here.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
it's
in
1 o'clock
Nova
here.
No wonder
Been
I'm
on
out
for
to
3
lunch.
hours.
Yeah, I'm in Nova Scotia, sorry. So
Yeah.
are we allowed to stay on or do we get off now?
I mean, you're welcome to stay on if you want to. I will stop the recording at this point.
Okay.
And folks might need to eat and get up for a bit.
Yeah,
So now we can say what we really want? I'm sorry.
Ooh, the recording
I'm the
stopped.
joker over here.
Before we do whatever comes next, we really have to thank you for
Yes.
Brian, Lee, Gordon, Dennis,
Yes.
and Lorraine. Thank you. Thank you so much for being part of this. And actually, I would have to say that this book symposium is unlike any I've ever been at. So thank you for that too. Okay, it has been wonderful to see you all on screen, and while I too would like to be in your company, I really am kind of with Gord. When we were trying to organize this, Gordon from the very beginning wanted to be on a screen. He didn't want to have to increase the carbon footprint, and I so valued that. I mean, I thought, yay, this is someone who's putting his, his plane ticket where his mouth is or something, I don't know. And actually every time this is our second time doing it, and both have been digital. So Gordon has been able to stick to his principles, and I've enjoyed doing that too. So thank you. And if we were in person, as Lorraine knows, there would be gifts. So I guess we're just going to give you the gift of our thank you.
Sandra, I think we all received gifts today already.
I agree. Really, really great.
And I really want to continue talking about the journal, Dennis, if you have more time.